The following program is a UWTV classic.
A bird am I. Behold the wings by which I fly. Now cruel, them to me deny. A true people are we. Behold our hands by which we see. Always cruel, them to us impede. Slowly, but surely, we shall be free.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello, and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. My guest today is Oliver Sacks. He teaches neurology at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx, New York. He's a doctor. He's also an author who writes about his fascination with people who, through no choosing or fault of their own, have been pushed out of the mainstream. People, for example, who suffer from debilitating migraines, or people who mistake their wives for hats. His newest book is called Seeing Voices, A Journey into the World of the Deaf. Welcome to Upon Reflection. This book is a little different than your other books. It has something of a different history and some different origins. You say you were incited to write this book.
Yes, well, it started unusually for me by reading another book on the subject, a history of the deaf and their education in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this astounded me, it outraged me, it made me want to see for myself what it was like now.
Why? Why did it astound you?
Well, the story was really very much to do with language, how deaf people had been dismissed and denied legal rights until the 1750s, when the first attention was paid to their language. De l'Épée, who was a great priest in Paris, thought that their language was the language of Adam, a universal language. Of course it wasn't. There are hundreds of different sign languages, but he learned French Sign Language. He established the first school. Within 20 years, one had educated deaf people who themselves wrote and taught. And life was revolutionized for deaf people, first in Europe and then in the States, until 1880, when the use of sign language was banned from education. And since then, and this was the story I read.
And this is what incited you to write your own book about the deaf. This book is interesting also because as you were learning and writing this book, you made the decision that you'd leave in ideas that were wrong, that you had come to feel were wrong, but you wanted them in the book as a kind of document of your own experience.
Well, this is, the book really has the shape of a journey, and one makes errors, you go in the wrong directions, you come to the wrong conclusions, you revise things, and I mean, one can write a book two ways. You can sort of blunder around and then see how it is and just give the royal path, or you can sort of give the story of your own rambling, and for better or worse, I've rambled and and brought the reader along on my rambles.
Give me an example of one of the mistakes or the misconceptions that you discovered you had.
Well, certainly one which was a common one is not realizing at the start that sign language really is a language. I took it to be a form of gesture or pantomime or English on the hands, and or perhaps a very rudimentary sort of language. I had to go to Gallaudet, to this astounding University of the Deaf, and see everything in sign, philosophy classes, science classes, before it came home to me that anything which could be expressed in spoken language could be expressed as powerfully and clearly in sign language. And then that was one thing. I think another thing was, as a doctor, I felt used to dealing with patients with disabilities, with handicaps, and first thought of deafness in that light. And I had to change to see the pluses, not simply a form of coping, but how an entirely different identity and sensibility and community and culture could all develop around a different mode of language.
A couple of the things that struck me very early on in your book, within the first 2 or 3 pages, a comment you made about what separate lives we live from the deaf, and really how many people live their lives without knowing a deaf person, without having some kind of communication with a deaf person. You talked about that being pretty much your own experience. The other, a wonderful little footnote, I think on page 3, where you talk about Chinese sign and French sign, Yiddish sign, and I had thought sign was sign, when really it's as varied as the spoken languages on the globe.
Yes, I mean, across the United States and Canada, one has American Sign Language, but there are all sorts of different signs. American Sign Language is partly derived from French Sign Language by a historical accident. It's very different from British Sign Language. There was an amazing international festival of deaf people in Washington last year, when deaf people came from 81 different countries with their own sign languages, and there were also 19 or 20 different national theatres of the deaf. But it wasn't a Babel. Although the languages are so different, I think deaf people have an astonishing ability to negotiate each other's languages and understand the conventions and grammars of other languages. And certainly by the end of the week, there was a fair communication, and one saw that a global community and a global culture might be possible among deaf people, which it isn't among us.
Mm. If you studied the history of sign and how the different types of sign developed around the world, would it seem a lot like the history of spoken language? Did it travel in the same way?
I think it would seem like the history of spoken language, but accelerated, because it might only take 2 or 3 generations for a fairly highly sophisticated sign language to occur. One deaf person, or for that matter 2 deaf people, can't create a language, spoken or signed. They can create some words or some signs. You have to have another generation. You have to have children and a child's nervous system to bring grammar and bring the whole richness of a language. But certainly in 3 or 4 generations you can have a highly evolved sign language.
Looking at the importance of sign, there was a phrase in your book, language transforms experience, and how the learning of sign for a deaf child or for a deaf person transforms the world and allows them to understand abstractions and make connections that otherwise would never happen.
Well, of course, this is happening for most of us, say, in the 3rd and 4th year of life. Deaf people may not be given good access to a language they can learn easily, and so one can have the appalling possibility of an intelligent person without good language. And I saw a number of deaf children like this, and I was haunted by
very
what could happen
sad stories.
to them. Yes, and not simply difficulties in communication, but as you say, difficulties in abstraction, in intellectual development, and a sort of confinement to the immediate and the here and now. And one needs language to break out of that box, to get access to the world of meaning and culture. And certainly a sign language will do this as well as any spoken language. But you must have some language, and when you're very young.
You write so eloquently about what sign can do, and not only for people who can't hear, but for people who speak, and the benefits that learning sign can bring to them. And yet, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, the use and acceptance of sign language has been in, it's been out. Why, given its benefits, the richness that it gives people's lives, would it not be encouraged?
Well, I think it is being now. I think things are changing very much in the 80s, and I think they'll change more in the 90s. There's been a fascinating experiment in in Prince George County in Maryland, where kindergarten children have been introduced to sign language at 4 or 5, and they love it. They see it as play, but in fact it's an important instrument which can accelerate their reading and also some of their powers of visual analysis, and it can sort of wake up parts of the brain and abilities which might otherwise be dormant.
You write in the book, though, that things have not always been this way, that there have been, it's almost like sort of waves of acceptance, and then all of a sudden the use of sign has been discouraged and the deaf encouraged to communicate in other ways. Why would it be discouraged?
Paradoxically, I think some of the success of the signing schools in the last century made people think that if deaf people did so well with signing, wouldn't they do even better with speaking? Many people, including Alexander Graham Bell, who was a very major and possibly a rather negative figure in all this, felt that speech was divine, speech was the only real language, and signing was something which should be underground if it existed at all. Again, there's been a misapprehension which is still very strong, that something which is not genuine signing, but something called signed English, which is simply English on the hands, a sort of word for word or sign for word transliteration without any genuine structure or grammar of its own. I think there's been a misapprehension that this is necessary to teach deaf people English, but it's not. Deaf people can be bilingual, and they can sign and learn English perfectly well simultaneously.
Talking with Oliver Sacks, this is Upon Reflection. We're going to watch now a performance, a political commentary of sorts on deaf education, performed by Howie and Billy Seago.
A hearing man and a hearing woman met, fell in love, got married, and had a baby. Hello, hello. Our baby is deaf. 90% of all deaf children are born to hearing parents. Doctor, what do we do now? We can teach them to be normal. All deaf mutes can be taught speech. 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 Ball. 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 Ball.
B. Owl. Owl. Day. Day. We. Year. Buckle. Be loudy. Man loudy. Be better.
Doctor, what do we do now? You should speak and sign at the same time. Total communication. You should use signed exact English, SEE, total communication. Total communication, SEE. We will use signed exact English now. See?
I am to seeing moon that the moon is to seeing me.
The various systems of signing English are not true languages. They were developed not through regular use by deaf people, but through arbitrary decisions made by committees of educators. Signed English lacks the power of the system of rules created by many generations of deaf people. And the task for a person attempting to speak and sign simultaneously is overwhelming. A person will typically begin to focus on the speech portion of the signal and omit signs randomly. So, most of the total communication is largely unintelligible by deaf children.
I need to knowing that English very good. Am I?
Hey, why are they laughing at me? Oh, ignore them. We tried our best. Hey, are you deaf? Yes, I'm deaf. I'm deaf too. You are too? Sign language in the hands of its masters is a most beautiful and expressive language. Sign language is an effective means of intercourse with deaf people. There is no satisfactory substitute. It is impossible for those who do not know sign language to comprehend its powerful influence on the moral and social happiness of the deaf. It is impossible for them to see its wonderful power of carrying thought to intellects which would otherwise be in perpetual darkness. They cannot appreciate the hold it has upon the deaf. So long as there are two deaf people upon the face of the earth, and those two deaf people get together, sign language will be in use. Long since bondage, slowly but surely, we shall be free.
We've been watching a performance by Howie and Billy Seago, professional actors, a performance about the education of the deaf. And Dr. Oliver Sacks, it was like watching the pages of your book come to life.
It was absolutely wonderful, and you know, I'm only an outsider, and I could be wrong, but this is such a powerful view from the inside, and one which is, I think, which deaf people have always felt. Towards the end of that, there was a wonderful reminiscence of the passage which I use as an epigraph for my book from Shu Lalong when he wrote in 1911, at the darkest time for deaf people. The time is much brighter now, but still ASL is not used in American education. There's still this signed English which is supposed to be for the deaf, but it's not easy to understand or to make. It's not a good language.
And as you said, it doesn't have the structure and the syntax and all of the tools that a language should have.
No, and it has no potential for art or passion.
What percentage would you say of deaf people in this country have the tools that we just saw Howie and Billy Seago using?
Well, Howie and Billy, of course, are actors and artists and have the most heightened form of sign available to them. But the majority of children born deaf, or perhaps 2/3 of them, I think, have fluent ASL, fluent sign language. But it needs to be 100%, and they need to have a good first language. Everything else can come on top of that. It's possible that fluent speech, certainly there should be fluent reading and writing. Every deaf child needs to be bicultural and bilingual, and maybe fluent speech and lip reading. But it's devastating to a child not to have a good language.
It seems like one of the most startling statistics came early in this piece, in that 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents who go through all different sorts of stages in trying to figure out what to do. And in your book you mentioned that it's children who are raised by deaf parents who are often the ones who learn the earliest and are the greatest fluent speakers of sign, and in fact the leaders of the Gallaudet revolt
yes,
were
absolutely.
all children of deaf parents.
The most confident. I mean, they have never known the frightening isolation and problems which perhaps 90% of deaf children sometimes run into. No, it's a most complex, delicate matter for a parent who finds that they have a deaf child, and they will seek in all directions, they'll get conflicting advice, they will have conflicting needs. They will want to bring the child into their own fold, and I think it needs a special sort of generosity and selflessness to realize that the child needs a double identity, perhaps needs an identity as a signer and as a deaf person. And then in the strength of that identity can come to them.
It's almost as if the parent has to recognize that there will be a separate life this child has.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
The closeness and the intimacy that they had thought of during the pregnancy and before they discovered the deafness is just never going to be. There will always be a separateness.
No, but there can be separateness and intimacy. I think that if one forces a child, if one denies the child its own development and forces it into your development, then one can, certainly make an enemy of the child, or perhaps at least impede the child's own autonomy. But if the child has autonomy and has its own language, then there could be intimacy. I saw this so beautifully. I describe it in the book with this little girl, Charlotte, who was hearing parents themselves decided to learn sign, as did neighbours and others, and Charlotte then had this double identity. She wasn't lost to her parents through being signing. They might have lost her if they'd prevented her from signing.
Again, it's that paradox. The very thing that will help is the thing people are most afraid of and want to turn away from.
Right.
I was thinking in the history of sign, and again, this sort of wave of acceptance and rejection, we're now back in acceptance, that technology is now emerging so quickly, and there are now all kinds of technological devices that are being used. And if, again, there isn't some kind of danger of seeing technology as the answer, and again that the wave go down, and again the rejection of sign, if you see any danger of that.
Oh yes, well now of course Bell, who was a real technological genius and who had a deaf wife and a deaf mother, invented the telephone for deaf people to speak in. But of course this wasn't a very useful invention. Deaf people really couldn't use the telephone until the mid-70s, when teletypes, TTYs or TDDs, were brought in. And now it's very easy for deaf people to phone one another or to fax one another. On the other hand, some of the physicality of the deaf community, I think the deaf clubs, the beautiful traditions of deaf storytelling and poetry may have suffered a little bit from this. I think technology has a great deal to offer deaf people. I think videotapes can to some extent become the books of deaf people. All sorts of wonderful sign performances need to be preserved on film or videotape. It's possible that the use of computers may make more possible a form of written sign language, though whether deaf people would like that or not isn't quite clear. But with things like cochlear implants, one sees statements like, with the development of the cochlear implant, the deaf schools will be cleared out in a decade. And this is a sort of statement which outrages deaf people because they see it practically as murderous in intent. And it's a purely medical statement. And I think deaf people, must always maintain this linguistic community and the special culture of their own.
How has writing this book changed how you look at the world?
I think it's opened me up a bit. To some extent, as a physician, I would always think in terms of normal and abnormal and normal and deviance. And here I have to recognize diversity, modes of language, modes of sensibility which are equal to one another. And I think it sort of made me a bit less of a pathologist and a bit more of a Democrat.
It's funny that you would say that, because I think most people would think of you as a very democratic physician. If the archetype of the doctor is a cool, cold, distant, can't get too close to the patients, you embrace patients. You could live without being close to them.
No, I think you're right. I think that is the case.
How can doctors say that can't be done, that it's destructive to do that?
Well, you mustn't identify with the patient. You mustn't sort of get unanchored yourself, but I think you must empathically enter someone's world, a patient's world, or if you can, the world of a deaf person, absolutely as fully as possible. And I think medicine or science or anything without empathy is a disaster.
It must be a difficult balancing act. Sort of like the balancing act you talked about a bit ago for the hearing parent who discovers they have a deaf child. Intimacy and letting go at the same time.
But sort of intimacy and detachment and a double identity, they do go together.
Dr. Oliver Sacks, your next book, actually inspired by this book.
Well, I've become fascinated by the visual imagination. I mean, Seeing Voices is much more about seeing than not hearing, and it's going to be a study of some artists with unusual neurological conditions, I think, which have entered creatively into their imagination and their art.
And eventually down the road, a book on Tourette's and heaven only knows what else. Dr. Oliver Sacks, I want to thank you so much for being a guest on Upon Reflection.
Thank you.
It's really been a great pleasure having you here.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.